Welcome to the Zen Studies Podcast. I'm Tomio Burke. Thanks to new supporting members of the podcast, Holger from Hamburg, Germany, Olivia from Brooklyn, New York, Dan from right here in Portland, Oregon, and Paul from Somerville, Massachusetts. So I'm working on the 7th chapter of my book, The 10 Fields of Zen, a primer for practitioners, and that will be released before the end of the month. And I'm fighting a cold, so this episode will be a little shorter than usual. In a time of political divisiveness, many of us look to the three treasures of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha for solace and strength and guidance. So I offer a few Dharma teachings I have found useful for these things. A recipe for sustainable bodhisattva practice. If you care about the welfare of all beings, not just you and yours, there are sustainable ways to live your life as a bodhisattva. In December 2021, I published episode 188. What does practice look like when your country is broken? Where I offered 3 ingredients or components that need to be included in your practice if you want to maintain an open and attentive heart and a bodhisattva's sense of responsibility, but also avoid burnout, overwhelm, depression, or despair. I've discussed these 3 ingredients many times on the podcast: bearing witness to the suffering in the world, taking care of yourself and your life in order to stay strong, and taking action or generous engagement with the world. So I recommend listening to 188 for more on how to balance the 3 ingredients in the stew of your practice in a potent and sustainable way. And I recently realized my 3 ingredients are almost exactly the same as the 3 tenets of the Zen Peacemaker's order. Theirs are not knowing, bearing witness, and taking action. So not knowing is defined by them as letting go of fixed ideas about yourself, others, and the universe. I discussed what we mean by not knowing in Zen in episode 32. The practice of not knowing, relief, intimacy, and ground for effective action. And I agree that it's extremely important. And by the way, in the page for this episode, I have links to all of these other podcast episodes and to the 3 tenets of the Zen Peacemaker's order. So I do like my formulation of 3 ingredients because of the inclusion of taking care, acknowledging that we won't be able to do the other aspects of the practice if we don't take care of ourselves and our lives. But maybe that goes without saying. After all, Zen teacher Bernie Glassman and the Zen Peacemaker's Order have a lot more credibility than I do when it comes to social action. So I recommend checking them out. The magic of the middle way. It's amazing how often the teaching of the middle way is applicable to our life and practice. The middle way is a dynamic and responsive engagement with life achieved by refusing to get caught in either side of a dualism. Whenever we seem to be faced with only 2 alternatives, neither of which seems great, we can look for the middle way. I thought of the middle way after our recent national election in the U.S., when I saw myself and others being pulled either toward a conclusion that everything was going to be okay, or toward a conclusion that the world was going to hell in a handbasket. I even heard people arguing about which side was correct. Heck, I wanted to jump in and argue for one side or another. However, reality can't be reduced to dualisms. Now, we have to make judgment calls in order to make decisions in life, but there's nothing inherently true about either half of a dualism, and getting attached to either side is a recipe for misery and conflict. So I discuss this kind of application of the middle way teaching at length in episode 191, Contemplating the Future the middle way between dread and hope. Practicing with fear, hatred, and anger. Practicing with something means you turn toward your experience of it and ask, what can I do in this situation to relieve suffering and increase my peace of mind, clarity, and compassion? We don't have control over everything, and sometimes negative and painful emotions will arise. Sometimes it's even appropriate that they arise. However, in our practice, we cultivate faith that there is always something we can do to improve our internal experience of a situation, no matter what is happening around us. In episode 130, Practicing with Fear in Buddhism, I talk about steps we can take when we experience fear. First, we become mindful of it. Fear has arisen in me. Then we look closely at our fear, trying to discern which parts of it are natural, informative, even motivating, and which parts are debilitating and based on attachments, expectations, or assumptions we can let go of. Then we take steps that we know promote our well-being, including keeping up our practice and spending time with good spiritual friends who will support our efforts to cultivate clarity, equanimity, and compassion rather than feeding our fears. You might also listen to episode 147, Loving Kindness or Metta Practice as an Antidote to Fear and Anxiety. If you need a Buddhist perspective on the prevalence of fear, anger, and hatred in our larger world, check out episode 65, Dealing with Fear, Anger, and Hatred as a Buddhist. There I discuss what leads human beings to indulge and manifest their fear, anger, and hatred in the world, and how we aspire to respond to it with non-hatred and compassion, but also by setting boundaries. Clearly, finding an authentic Buddhist response to suffering in the world has been a topic of great interest to me throughout my practice. You might want to listen to or read a creative exercise I did in episode 266, What Would the Buddha Say About the Suffering in the World?, where I created an imaginary dialogue between a student, like myself, wondering how the individual practitioner addresses collective suffering. A dialogue between a student and the Buddha himself. I just made up what the Buddha would say. Practicing kshanti, patience or forbearance, especially with one another. Finally, I suggest turning to the teachings on the perfection of kshanti, which can be translated as patience, forbearance, endurance, or tolerance. I discuss kshanti in detail in episode 153. Kshanti, the perfection of endurance. Life's not always a bed of roses. Naturally, the practice of kshanti is valuable with respect to the situations we are faced with in the world and with respect to our own attempt to understand, cope, and respond to things. In particular, though, I've been thinking recently about the importance of practicing kshanti with those we are used to more or less agreeing with. I've noticed a whole host of reactions to the recent U.S. presidential election, for example. Among those unhappy with the result, there are people firmly convinced everything will be okay, and people deeply impacted by ongoing fear and anxiety. There are people who think they understand why everything has turned out the way it has, and others who are struggling with shock and confusion. There are people who can't bear to watch any news or talk about politics at all, and others who can't stop talking about it. All this diversity in reactions isn't itself problematic, but I notice my own inclination to feel impatience or judgment about certain kinds of reactions, or to convince others to feel the way I do. It seems like a skillful way to support one another at this time, to listen and accept one another's responses, at least for the time being, setting aside our own concerns and opinions to witness how someone else is dealing with the situation and just letting that be. When witnessing someone's response, it may help you to remain silent or be gentle about your own point of view if you keep in mind the teaching of skillful means. I discussed this in episode 40, being beneficial instead of right, the Buddhist concept of skillful means. Even if you're convinced you're right, to speak skillfully, you consider a number of things, including, can the person even hear you at the moment? Are they able to understand and consider what you're saying? If someone can't accept or agree with you, is there some goal you might hold in common? And even if someone ends up agreeing with you, how much change are they capable of at this time? So that is it for now. I will be back soon with a new full episode. Thank you for listening.